All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to Unslaved. Hope you're doing well. We're happy to be back with you once again to cover a subject we've actually hinted at for a long time and wanted to get into. There's just been so many things that we had to bring into the fore first. And so we're welcoming back Caleb once again. Always a long time guest on this show, continuing the lines of research into these areas. We're talking about the British Israelite deception. This should be fascinating. Looking at some interesting information, some whistleblowing movies, etc. So, welcome, gentlemen. Always good to see you. And Caleb, welcome back to Enslaved, man. Good to have you back.
Good to be back.
So, Michael,
Yeah.
over to you just to give a little bit of context for people about this subject and then where we're going to be headed here.
Yeah. Well, welcome back, Caleb. Thank you for coming. I know we've been looking at this subject now for actually several weeks because we did want to cover it. It's a huge subject. There's no way that even in one, there's no way that even in one show that we could possibly do justice to the whole thing. But in my Irish Origins of Civilization, Volume 1 book, I did cover it in chapter 19, the British Israelite deception. People will remember that because in order to present my controversial thesis about the movement of the elements of civilization from the west to the east, you obviously are shaking the opposite theory to its foundations. And this is the ubiquitous historical idea that the elements of civilization, whatever they may be, from something quite simple to high mathematics, pyramid building, all of that, let alone music and just basket weaving or letters or music. Uh, Everyone believes they came from the East. Some believe they came from the Far East. Other people from the Middle East, and some people think that it's from Anatolia, the steppes of Russia. Of course, most people would say Greece and Rome is where a lot of the classical motifs came from. But in the end, and Caleb, we recently did also the show on when Scotland was Jewish, which propounds the very same theory. Now, it's interesting that that could be considered a sort of subset of British Israelitism in a way for a couple of reasons. And one of them is, well, look, it just talks about the movement of Jews from the East into the Western lands, into the British Isles. Now, granted, these are later migrations. These are into, AD. And what we're talking about is more movements of prehistoric times. But this movement of Jews into Scotland, which we touched on in that program when Scotland was Jewish, that's still falling under this basic idea that if anything happened to bring civilization to these islands in the West, it came from the East. And that's just standard. That is just accepted. So I wrote 2 volumes, mustering together all of the facts that I could find that, threw doubt on that and tried to present the alternative view on that. And it's still very unpopular. But why I did it is because of the myths of Ireland. There is no doubt when you come to looking at the mythologies of Britain and of Ireland that they're telling you that it came from the West. And they are in no doubt about it. That the great waves of migration, there was about 5. And out of those, the very special tribes that came didn't come from any eastern lands. It's quite clearly written. But what is what is west of Britain? The Atlantic Ocean. So were these old scribes who wrote these chronicles crazy? They knew there was nothing out there. So why would they write it? Why would the myths? And that's what people do. They say, well, it is a myth. There's your answer, Michael. They were a bit loony. These were prehistoric people, so we don't believe them. There's nothing out there in the West. And when we talk about the Fortunate Isles and all the stuff you bring to bear, and the 13 treasures of Britain, and all of this stuff about Atlantis, we know that that's nonsense. And because we know it's nonsense, then there can only be one story that's plausible. But see, the thing is, when you dig into the story that's mainstream, you find that it's not that plausible. It's certainly interesting. I told you it's a huge subject, and there's many prongs to it. there is this later story of the Jews that we covered, the movement of later Jews in more historical time into Scotland. That's fascinating. But that's only one tiny little subset of this larger theory that was propounded in earlier centuries, and not so much by Jews. What we're talking about here, the British Israelitism, is really a Christian idea. It was an idea formed by Gentiles mostly about the Jews. So let's get that clear. The Jews themselves have not propounded any such theory about these movements from the east to the west. This was done by Western scholars. It fell out of reputation later, but I focused on it in the Irish Origins book because it is based in, it's a very cunning, that's why I call it a deception. And I'm asking people to, believe that, but of course it's up to them when they hear some facts about it, like we're going to present today, and when they read the book and they check into it, there's plenty of information online. You may disagree. You may go, wow, I never knew any of this. This sounds really plausible. I dig in very critically, but why I had to do it was, one, you see, is that this British Israelite theory is one of those theories that if you buy into it, then it makes it far more difficult to accept the west to east movement of civilization, number one. And number two, it also makes it it obscures the movement of the Atnists out of Egypt, the Hyksos, the Atnists, that whole thing we've done time and time again. It obscures that movement. It sort of brackets that as kind of unimportant and puts your focus on the houses of Israel. And that's why I call it a deception. It was already a deception that we were never told that the Israelites and the Hyksos are one and the same people. We had to wait for Ralph Ellis and other scholars. We had to wait, a long time for this to be revealed. So there was already one glaring deception, other than Josephus, and a little bit of ruminations from scholars such as Sigmund Freud or whoever, right? We never heard publicly that it was never ever taught, not even by Jews, taught to Jews or to Gentiles, that the Hyksos of Egypt and the Israelites are one and the same. So already there's a deception there. So there's two reasons why this needed to be looked at. One is because it obscures the west to east movement of the elements of civilization, a subject you may never come across if you buy into this British Israelite deception. And it refuses it obscures the true movement of the Atnists out of Egypt, Akhenaten and his crew, and their move through history. One we really need to know about if you're really going to crack history at all. Well, that's bracketed. That's almost a sideshow. It's not even mentioned at all by British Israelites. So I spotted something cunning there. But why it's also of interest to me is because anyone who grows up looking at the heraldry of Ireland and the heraldry of Britain and the heraldry of Europe, this is an interest to a lot of people without knowing anything what we're talking about now. They just hey, why is that triple crown? Why the dove? Why the little symbol of the ark? Noah's little ark there. Look at that. Oh, look at here's a harp of King David. Here's what looks like a shamrock or three interlocking circles. Here's a Star of David. A Star of David and a red hand. Well, where did that come from? And all of that. That's a great fascination. What about the red lion? And then when somebody digs into this, they're going to come smack up against this British Israelitism because it's going to tell you, well, actually, do you know something? Those are symbols of the holy Israelites who wandered westward at various times in biblical times. And you just go, what? The unicorn even? The lion and the unicorn, sure, that's even on royalty. And the royalty has in its insignias lots of other symbols that come from the Middle East and can be actually taken back to the 12 tribes of Israel. It is a fact. There's whole books on it. We'll cite one a little bit later. And Caleb's been looking into a couple of books by top British Israelite writers. And I mentioned these people. I actually mentioned, a lot of the history of it in that chapter, chapter 19. But we'll talk about those guys in a minute. I just wanted to give it a context here because symbolism again plays a big role. If you haven't heard of British Israelitism and then you hear about it, one of their claims is that this remarkable symbolism, bizarre symbolism that you find on the crests and arms and heraldry of the West comes from the Israelites. You can say it's Jewish if you want, but remember the Jews are only 2 tribes out of 12. So again, you're not totally right. So the British Israelites prefer correctly, to use the term Israelite because you're dealing with 10 tribes. And so this is the background really. That it helps to explain that. And it also explains a lot of architectural motifs and a lot of other little mythologies. Like I said, the very symbols on the flag of Ulster, and loads of other bizarre sacerdotal symbolism. And so I have 2 slides, David, if you would mind bringing those up, reading them one by one. It'll help with the intro here, and we'll move to Caleb and get his take on it.
Get the right one here.
And I sent you a link as well. We can read.
Yeah. We do all of them. I'll do the when we do the slides first, and then
please.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Works.
So, okay, you guys can see this one, okay?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. All right, so this one, just from the online encyclopedia, British Israelism, sometimes called Anglo-Israelism, is a complex set of theories, not necessarily compatible with each other, that have in common the idea that some ancient British people and or royal lineages were direct lineal descendants of some of the lost tribes of Israel. The theory has adherents among a minority of Christians, usually Protestants of British descent. And I'll bring up that other one here. Go. This one is from W.H. Bennett from Symbols of Our Celto-Saxon Heritage. He says, because of the false but very common idea that the Jews of today are all that remain of the ancient Israel people, it becomes necessary here to point out that, with the exception of very few individuals, none of the 10 tribed house of Israel and only a very small remnant of the 2 tribed house of Judah ever returned to Palestine after their deportation to Assyria and Babylon. With the fall of the empires that held them captive, the tribes became a part of that great northwestern migration of peoples into and across Europe that took place in the centuries just before the beginning of the Christian era.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. Can you hear me still?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, see how important that is? And then let's go to that poem. Just read the first caption, first stanza.
Sure.
Famous poem.
This is Jerusalem from Milton by William Blake.
Yeah.
And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green? And was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pastures seen? And did the countenance divine shine forth upon our clouded hills? And was Jerusalem builded here among these dark satanic mills?
Right. So there's the very famous poem that every school kid learned, and it's practically the #1 hymn sung in England, by the famous poet William Blake. That smacks of British Israelitism. Now, I always hesitate to limit Blake to one philosophy or one theology, but certainly in this most famous poem, the British Israelites have grabbed that and waved that. But what is the poem actually saying? It's actually now, again, extended to include Jesus himself. That's why this is so important. British Israelites also contend that not just the tribes of Israel, characters or other biblical characters like Jeremiah and Tefi came. Tara is in Ireland is considered to be named after an Egyptian queen, let alone other places.